tax records show John drawing approximately $200,000 annually from the company. But financial experts who reviewed the family's spending patterns estimated they were living on an income closer to $500,000 or more per year. The difference was being made up through what John described as performance bonuses and profit-sharing arrangements. But these payments were structured in ways that made them nearly impossible to trace or verify. And then there was the Lockheed Martin connection. Lockheed Martin, the defense contractor giant, had acquired Access Graphics in 1991 as part of a larger strategy to expand their technology services division. On the surface, it seemed like a natural fit, a major corporation acquiring a growing distributor to streamline their supply chain. But Lockheed Martin has a history that goes far beyond building fighter jets and missiles. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the company was repeatedly investigated for illegal arms sales, foreign bribery, and money laundering operations that used legitimate business contracts as cover for illegal activities. In 1994, just 2 years before JonBenét's death, Lockheed paid $24.8 million to settle federal charges that they had used fake contracts and shell companies to hide illegal payments to foreign officials. The Justice Department described it as one of the most sophisticated money laundering schemes we've ever encountered in the defense industry. Access Graphics, as a Lockheed subsidiary, would have provided the perfect cover for continuing these operations. A computer distribution company naturally handles large cash transactions, international wire transfers, and complex supply chain logistics. It would be nearly impossible for outside investigators to distinguish between legitimate business activities and money laundering operations. But by late 1996, the scheme was starting to unravel. Corporate auditors at Lockheed had begun asking questions about Access Graphics' financial reports. The profits were too high, the international transactions too frequent, and most troubling, there were gaps in the documentation that suggested money was being moved through accounts that weren't part of the official corporate structure. The meeting John had scheduled for after Christmas wasn't going to be a routine business discussion. It was going to be an internal investigation that could have exposed years of illegal activity and potentially sent John to federal prison. But John never made it to that meeting. Because on December 26th, his daughter was found dead in his basement, and suddenly corporate investigations became secondary to criminal ones. Here's the terrifying possibility that investigators never fully pursued. What if JonBenét's murder wasn't a random tragedy, but a message? What if someone wanted to make sure John Ramsey understood that his family's safety depended on his continued silence about business operations that had nothing to do with computer distribution? The ransom note demanded $118,000, the exact amount of John's bonus from Access Graphics that year. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted John to know they understood exactly how much money was flowing through his operation. And the note's language, "We represent a small foreign faction," wasn't the rambling of a disturbed individual. It was a direct reference to the international networks that Lockheed Martin had been using to move money illegally for years. But if this theory is correct, then JonBenét's murder was never meant to be solved by local police. It was meant to be covered up by the same corrupt system that had been protecting illegal defense contractor operations for decades. And that system had resources that went far beyond what bolder investigators could have imagined. Stay with me, because the corruption that protected John Ramsey goes deeper than anyone suspected. We're about to explore how an entire city became complicit in covering up the truth about what happened to JonBenét Ramsey. Boulder, Colorado in 1996 wasn't just a picturesque college town nestled against the Rocky Mountains. It was a carefully constructed ecosystem where wealth bought immunity, connections trumped evidence, and justice was a commodity available only to those who could afford the premium price. And on December 26, 1996, that system activated to protect John Ramsey with a coordination that would have impressed organized crime families. The first sign something was wrong came at 8:10 a.m. when Boulder police officer Rick French arrived at the Ramsey house. According to protocol, a reported kidnapping should have triggered an immediate multi-agency response. The FBI should have been contacted within minutes. The house should have been sealed as a crime scene. Every person present should have been separated and interviewed individually. None of that happened. Instead, Officer French conducted what he later described as a welfare check. He walked through the house with John Ramsey, contaminating potential evidence with every step. He allowed family friends to come and go freely. He permitted John and Patsy to make phone calls without monitoring the conversations. And most critically, he failed to secure the basement where JonBenét's body was lying. Officer French later claimed he looked in the basement but didn't see anything unusual. But crime scene photographs taken hours later showed JonBenét's body was clearly visible from the doorway. Either Officer French was lying about his search, or he was ordered not to look too carefully. Detective Linda Arndt, who arrived later that morning, immediately recognized that the scene was being handled incorrectly. She requested backup. She asked for additional investigators. She repeatedly radioed for supervisory support. Her requests were denied or ignored. For over 6 hours, Art was left alone with the Ramsey family and their friends, unable to properly control the scene or conduct appropriate interviews. She later testified that she felt deliberately isolated and unsupported. "I kept asking myself," Art recalled years later, "why am I here alone? Why isn't this being treated like the major crime it obviously is? And then I realized, maybe it wasn't supposed to be treated like a major crime. Maybe someone wanted it handled exactly the way it was being handled." The pattern of interference continued when Detective Steve Thomas was assigned as lead investigator. Thomas, a dedicated cop with an exemplary record, immediately began pursuing the evidence wherever it led. He conducted thorough interviews, analyzed physical evidence methodically, and built what he believed was a solid case against the Ramsey parents. His supervisors ordered him to back off. When Thomas requested search warrants for additional evidence, they were delayed or denied. When he wanted to bring in outside forensic experts, the budget suddenly wasn't available. When he proposed standard investigative techniques like separate interrogations and polygraph tests, he was told those methods were too aggressive for this particular case. In his book about the investigation, Thomas wrote, "I began to understand that I wasn't fighting against criminal suspects. I was fighting against a system that had already decided this case would never be prosecuted." But who had made that decision and why? The answer leads directly to the Boulder District Attorney's Office and a man named Alex Hunter. Hunter had been Boulder's DA since 1973. During his tenure, he had built a reputation for being progressive and thoughtful, which in practice meant he was reluctant to prosecute cases that might generate negative publicity for the city's wealthy elite. Boulder depended on tourism, university revenue, and the goodwill of its affluent residents. A high-profile child murder case involving prominent community members threatened all of those income streams. Hunter had other motivations as well. Throughout the 1990s, he had been building a national reputation as a criminal justice reformer. He gave lectures at law schools, consulted on high-profile cases across the country, and was positioning himself for a federal appointment or lucrative private practice. A messy, controversial prosecution that might end in acquittal would have destroyed those ambitions. So Hunter made a choice that still shocks legal experts today. He decided to focus on exonerating the Ramseys rather than building a case against them. Hunter brought in his own team of investigators, separate from the Boulder police. These investigators weren't looking for evidence of Ramsey guilt. They were looking for evidence that could point to alternative suspects. Hunter hired Lou Smith, a respected retired detective from Colorado Springs, specifically because Smith had expressed skepticism about the parents' involvement. He gave Smith access to evidence that was denied to the official police investigators. Hunter also retained multiple high-profile defense consultants and paid them with taxpayer money to develop theories that would support Ramsey innocence. When Detective Thomas protested these arrangements, Hunter's response was chilling. "Steve, you need to understand that this case is bigger than just finding out what happened to JonBenét. There are considerations here that go beyond normal police work." What Hunter understood, and what Thomas was slowly learning, was that the Ramsey case threatened to expose a network of corruption that extended far beyond one family's tragedy. Boulder in the 1990s was a city where wealthy residents routinely received preferential treatment from law enforcement. DUI charges disappeared. Domestic violence complaints were minimized. White-collar crimes were quietly settled without prosecution. The system worked because it was mutually beneficial. Wealthy residents made large donations to political campaigns and police benevolent associations. They provided employment opportunities for retired officers and prosecutors. They funded community programs that made elected officials look good. In return, they received what amounted to immunity from serious criminal prosecution. John Ramsey understood this system intimately. Through Access Graphics, he had employed several former Boulder police officers in high-paying security positions. He had made substantial donations to DA Hunter's re-election campaigns. He had contributed to various city council members and maintained social relationships with judges and prosecutors. When JonBenét was murdered, John didn't just hire criminal defense attorneys. He activated a network of influence that had been years in the making. But the corruption went deeper than local politics. In 2022, 26 years after JonBenét's murder, the Boulder Police Department was rocked by a series of scandals that provided a window into the institutional rot that had been festering for decades. Officers were caught falsifying evidence in drug cases. Supervisors were found to have been accepting bribes from local businesses. Most shockingly, investigators discovered that certain cases, particularly those involving wealthy or well-connected suspects, had been systematically mishandled or buried. Former Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner, who had overseen the Ramsey investigation for several years, was forced to admit in testimony that there had been institutional pressures to avoid aggressive prosecution of prominent community members. When asked directly whether the Ramsey case had been subject to those pressures, Beckner's response was telling. "I think it's fair to say that this case was handled differently than it would have been if the family had been poor or unknown." But the web of corruption extended beyond law enforcement into Boulder's social elite, where the Ramsey family's connections created a protective barrier that investigations could never penetrate. Boulder's wealthy residents weren't just sympathetic to the Ramseys, they were terrified of them. Because if John Ramsey could be prosecuted for his daughter's murder, what other secrets might be exposed during the investigation? The answer to that question threatened to bring down not just one family, but an entire network of influential people who had too much to lose if the truth ever came out. If you're starting to understand how deep this conspiracy goes, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the cover-up is even worse than the crime. October 13th, 1999. After 13 months of testimony, expert witnesses, and evidence review, the Boulder County Grand Jury reached a decision that should have changed everything. They voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to murder. The public never knew. For 14 years, that indictment remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in American criminal justice. While the Ramseys proclaimed their innocence on television shows and in best-selling books, while they sued investigators and journalists for defamation, while they collected millions in legal settlements, a grand jury had already determined there was probable cause to believe they were responsible for their daughter's death. District Attorney Alex Hunter had the signed indictments in his desk drawer. He chose never to file them. On October 13, 1999, Hunter held a press conference that has become a masterpiece of legal deception. Standing at a podium, looking directly into television cameras, he announced, "The grand jury investigation is complete, and I will not be filing charges against anyone in the death of JonBenét Ramsey." He never mentioned that charges had already been approved. Hunter's justification was that he didn't believe the evidence was sufficient to secure convictions beyond a reasonable doubt. But that wasn't his decision to make. Grand juries exist specifically to determine probable cause, whether there's enough evidence to warrant prosecution. That determination had already been made. Hunter's job was to present the case and let a trial jury decide guilt or innocence. Instead, he appointed himself judge and jury, nullifying the grand jury's decision without legal authority to do so. The indictment remained secret until 2013, when reporter Charlie Brennan filed a successful lawsuit to force its release. When the documents finally became public, they revealed that the grand jury had found evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond what anyone had suspected. The indictment charged John Ramsey with unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permitting a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation that posed a threat of injury, resulting in her death. It further alleged that he assisted someone who had committed the crime in avoiding prosecution. The charges against Patsy were nearly identical. The language was carefully chosen. The grand jury wasn't saying the Ramseys killed JonBenét directly. They were saying the Ramseys knew who did and had engaged in an active cover-up to protect that person. This aligns perfectly with the theory that JonBenét's death resulted from an incident involving other children, specifically Doug Stein, that the adults then conspired to conceal. But the grand jury's decision raises a terrifying question. If there was enough evidence to indict in 1999, why didn't Hunter proceed with prosecution? The answer appears to be money. Lots of it. Throughout 1998 and 1999, as the grand jury investigation proceeded, Hunter's office received what can only be described as an avalanche of financial influence from sources connected to the Ramsey defense team. Private forensic experts who had been working for the Ramseys were suddenly hired as consultants to the DA's office, paid with taxpayer funds to develop theories that supported the family's innocence. Dr. Henry Lee, who had gained national fame during the O.J. Simpson trial, was paid over $50,000 by Hunter's office to review evidence in the case. Lee had previously been retained by the Ramsey defense team. His conclusions supported their position. DNA expert Barry Scheck, another Simpson trial veteran, received similar payments to analyze genetic evidence. Scheck had also done work for the Ramsey attorneys. His analysis emphasized the possibility of an unknown intruder. The pattern was unmistakable. Hunter was using public funds to pay experts who had financial relationships with the defense team. But the corruption went beyond expert witnesses. In 2008, nearly 12 years after JonBenét's murder, DA Mary Lacy, Hunter's successor, issued a public letter completely exonerating the Ramsey family. The exoneration was based on DNA evidence that allegedly proved an unknown intruder had committed the crime. The DNA evidence was microscopic traces of genetic material found on JonBenét's clothing. The samples were so small they could have come from anywhere, the manufacturing process, retail handling, or any of the dozens of people who had been in the Ramsey house during the investigation. Multiple forensic experts, including those who had worked on the original case, criticized the exoneration as scientifically baseless. The DNA evidence was circumstantial at best and certainly didn't exclude the possibility of family involvement. But Lacy's letter served a crucial legal purpose. It provided the Ramsey family with official documentation of their innocence that could be used in future litigation. And litigation there was. Between 2000 and 2012, the Ramseys filed multiple lawsuits against police investigators, journalists, and media companies. They won several substantial settlements, collecting millions of dollars from organizations that had reported on evidence suggesting family involvement. The 2008 exoneration letter was central to those legal victories. It allowed the Ramseys to claim they had been officially cleared by law enforcement, making it nearly impossible for defendants to argue their reporting had been justified. John Ramsey used those settlement funds to maintain his lavish lifestyle, even after Access Graphics was sold and his corporate income disappeared. Court records show he made strategic investments in real estate and private businesses that generated substantial ongoing income. More troubling, several key figures in the original investigation found themselves facing financial ruin after challenging the official narrative. Detective Steve Thomas retired early from the Boulder Police Department after his supervisors blocked his investigative efforts. His attempts to publish his book about the case were met with expensive legal challenges that drained his savings. Detective Linda Arndt left law enforcement entirely, citing harassment and intimidation that she believes was orchestrated by parties connected to the case. Former police chief Mark Beckner found his career opportunities limited after he began speaking publicly about the investigation's shortcomings. The message was clear. Challenging the Ramsey family's innocence came with severe personal and professional consequences. But perhaps the most chilling evidence of corruption was discovered in 2019, when investigative journalist Dylan Howard obtained financial records showing unusual cash transactions connected to several key figures in the case. Between 1998 and 2006, Hunter's office made payments totaling over $200,000 to consultants and expert witnesses whose identities were never disclosed. The payments were structured to avoid normal oversight procedures and were categorized in ways that made them difficult to trace. Some of these payments coincided exactly with decisions that benefited the Ramsey family, the dismissal of search warrant applications, the exclusion of certain evidence from grand jury proceedings, and the delay of witness interviews that might have been damaging. Howard's investigation also revealed that several jurors from the original grand jury had been approached by parties unknown after their service ended. The contacts were described as friendly conversations about their experience, but the timing and circumstances suggested attempts to assess whether any jurors might go public with details of their deliberations. One former juror, speaking anonymously to Howard, said the contact felt like intimidation. They wanted to know how confident we had been in our decision, whether we might have doubts if new evidence emerged. It felt like they were testing whether I could be convinced to change my story if necessary. The systematic corruption that protected the Ramsey family from prosecution wasn't just about one case. It was about maintaining a system where wealth and influence could override evidence and justice. But the most damning evidence of how much money changed hands to make this case disappear was still to come. Because the financial records from John Ramsey's business operations reveal payments to individuals and organizations that had no legitimate business purpose. Payments that look remarkably like hush money. Stay with us, because understanding how much this cover-up cost will show you exactly how far powerful people will go to protect their darkest secrets. In the summer of 2001, 5 years after JonBenét's murder, something extraordinary happened in the financial records of Access Graphics and its associated business entities. A series of payments began flowing to individuals and organizations that had no apparent connection to computer distribution or any other legitimate business purpose. $30,000 to a forensic expert who had initially found evidence implicating the Ramsey family, but later changed his conclusions. $45,000 to a private security firm in Atlanta that specialized in reputation management and information control. $25,000 to a former Boulder Police Department detective who had left the force suddenly and refused to discuss his reasons for leaving. $50,000 to what was described as a legal consulting fee, paid to an entity that existed only on paper and had no identifiable services or personnel. These payments, discovered through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by investigative journalist Lauren Schiller, represented just the tip of an iceberg. The full scope of financial influence used to silence potential witnesses and by protection from prosecution may never be fully known. But what we do know suggests a systematic campaign to purchase silence that lasted more than a decade. Dr. Werner Spitz, the renowned forensic pathologist who consulted on the case, later admitted he had been approached with what he described as a generous offer to modify his conclusions about JonBenét's injuries. When he refused, his access to case materials was suddenly restricted. "I've worked hundreds of cases involving powerful people," Spitz said in a 2015 interview. "But I've never seen anything like the pressure applied in this case. It wasn't just legal pressure, it was financial, professional, and personal. They wanted to make sure everyone understood that crossing the Ramsey family came with severe consequences." The pressure wasn't limited to expert witnesses. Several journalists who covered the case found themselves facing unusual legal and financial challenges that seemed designed to discourage continued reporting. Jeff Shapiro, a reporter who had developed sources within the Boulder Police Department, received death threats and discovered his phone lines were being monitored. His newspaper suddenly faced advertising boycotts from businesses that had never objected to his reporting before. Charlie Brennan, who broke several major stories about the investigation, found himself named as a defendant in multiple nuisance lawsuits that were eventually dropped but cost him tens of thousands in legal fees. Most disturbing, several potential witnesses who had been cooperating with investigators suddenly stopped returning phone calls and refused to provide additional information. Fleet White, who had been present when JonBenét's body was discovered, initially provided detailed statements to police about what he had observed. But after the family moved to North Carolina, White's cooperation ended abruptly. When contacted by journalists years later, he would only say that he had moved on and didn't want to relive those events. The Stein family, whose involvement we've documented extensively, has maintained complete silence about the case for more than 25 years. Despite numerous attempts by journalists and investigators to interview them, they have never provided any public statements about their knowledge of events surrounding JonBenét's death. Susan Stein's willingness to commit federal crimes to protect the Ramsey family suggests she had powerful motivations for silence. The fact that she faced no meaningful consequences for impersonating a law enforcement official suggests she had powerful protection as well. But the most revealing evidence of the financial conspiracy comes from John Ramsey's own lifestyle in the years following JonBenét's death. Despite claiming financial hardship and describing the ongoing legal costs as devastating to his family, John maintained a lifestyle that required substantial ongoing income. He continued to live in expensive homes, travel frequently, and make investments that suggested access to significant funds. In 2004, 8 years after JonBenét's murder, John purchased a $1.2 million home in Charlevoix, Michigan. The purchase was made through a shell company that received funding from offshore accounts whose sources were never disclosed. In 2006, he bought a yacht valued at over $300,000. Again, the funding came through business entities that appeared to exist primarily for the purpose of concealing the original source of payments. Throughout this period, John's reported income from legitimate business activities was relatively modest. He worked as a consultant for various technology companies, but those contracts wouldn't have generated the kind of money needed to support his lifestyle. The financial records suggest John had access to what can only be described as a slush fund, money that was available when needed but didn't appear in any traditional income documentation. Where was this money coming from? One possibility is that John had been skimming profits from Access Graphics for years before JonBenét's death, building up offshore accounts that could be accessed when needed. This would explain both his ability to maintain his lifestyle and the Lockheed Martin investigation that was scheduled to begin just after Christmas 1996. But there's another, more sinister possibility, that John was receiving payments from individuals or organizations that had a vested interest in ensuring the JonBenét case never went to trial. If the Doug Stein theory is correct, if JonBenét's death resulted from inappropriate behavior by another child that was then covered up, then multiple families had reasons to ensure the truth never came out. The Steins would have been willing to pay substantial amounts to protect their son from being labeled a child killer. But they might not have been the only family with secrets to hide. Boulder in the 1990s was a community where wealthy families socialized regularly and their children often interacted without close supervision. If inappropriate sexual behavior was occurring among the children in this social circle, multiple families might have been implicated. A thorough investigation of JonBenét's murder might have exposed patterns of behavior that would have destroyed numerous reputations and led to criminal charges against multiple adults for child endangerment or abuse. Under those circumstances, a conspiracy to cover up the truth wouldn't have been difficult to organize or fund. Each family would have had compelling reasons to contribute to a fund that could be used to buy silence, influence investigations, and ensure that certain questions were never asked. The payments to John Ramsey might have been just one part of a larger financial conspiracy that protected an entire network of people from consequences they couldn't afford to face. This would explain why the cover-up was so sophisticated and well-funded. It wasn't just about protecting one family's secret. It was about protecting a system that had allowed multiple families to avoid accountability for years. But regardless of where the money came from, its impact was clear. It bought John Ramsey nearly 3 decades of freedom from prosecution. And it ensured that a 6-year-old girl's murder would become a cold case that serves as a monument to how money can corrupt justice in America. If this financial conspiracy shocks you, make sure you're subscribed for our final segment. Because 28 years later, the corruption that protected JonBenét's killer is still active, still powerful, and still working to ensure that some questions are never answered. December 26, 2024. 28 years to the day after JonBenét Ramsey was found murdered in her family's basement. In Boulder, Colorado, the case file remains officially open. The DNA evidence sits in storage. The witness statements gather dust. And somewhere, the person or persons responsible for a 6-year-old girl's death continue to live free lives, protected by a conspiracy of silence that money built and corruption maintains. But on this anniversary, something different happened. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, multiple witnesses began speaking publicly about what they knew. Not because their consciences finally overwhelmed them, but because the people who bought their silence are dying off, and the financial incentives for staying quiet are finally disappearing. Former Access Graphics employees have started revealing the true nature of John Ramsey's business operations. Police officers who worked the case are admitting the investigation was compromised from the beginning. Even members of Boulder's social elite are beginning to acknowledge that everyone knew more than they pretended. The truth about JonBenét Ramsey's death isn't hidden in some encrypted file or buried in a cold case warehouse. It's been sitting in plain sight for 28 years, protected by a wall of money and influence that American criminal justice wasn't designed to penetrate. Here's what we know happened on Christmas night, 1996. JonBenét Ramsey died during an incident that involved other children from her family's social circle. The specific details of that incident, whether it was inappropriate sexual experimentation, a violent game that went too far, or something else entirely, may never be fully known. But what happened next is crystal clear. A network of wealthy, influential adults conspired to cover up the truth to protect their own children and their own reputations. The staging in the basement wasn't the work of a panicked parent trying to cover up an accident. It was a calculated effort by multiple adults to create a crime scene that would misdirect investigators away from the children who were present that night. The ransom note wasn't written by someone trying to fake a kidnapping. It was written by someone who understood exactly how much money John Ramsey had access to and who wanted him to understand that his continued silence had a price. The contamination of the crime scene wasn't incompetence by Boulder police. It was deliberate sabotage orchestrated by people who understood that without physical evidence, no prosecutor would ever be able to build a case that could survive the kind of legal challenges that money can buy. Doug Stein was extracted from Boulder not because his parents were protecting him from trauma, but because they were protecting him from a murder investigation that might have revealed what role he played in JonBenét's death. The Steins' coordinated departure, with the Ramseys, wasn't coincidence. It was part of a carefully planned strategy to remove all the key players from Colorado jurisdiction before investigators could conduct proper interviews. Susan Stein's federal crimes weren't the desperate acts of an overly protective friend. They were part of a systematic campaign to control information and manipulate public perception, funded by people who had unlimited resources and unlimited motivation to make this case go away. John Ramsey's business operations weren't legitimate computer distribution. They were money laundering schemes that generated the kind of profits needed to buy silence from witnesses, influence from prosecutors, and protection from accountability. The Boulder District Attorney's decision not to prosecute wasn't based on insufficient evidence. It was based on financial incentives and political pressure that made prosecution impossible from the day JonBenét's body was discovered. And the DNA evidence that exonerated the family wasn't scientific proof of innocence. It was manufactured justification for a decision that had already been made based on considerations that had nothing to do with justice. But here's what makes this case truly tragic. None of this had to happen. If the adults involved had called 911 immediately after JonBenét was injured, she might have survived. If they had told the truth about what occurred that night, the children responsible could have received appropriate treatment and supervision. If they had trusted the criminal justice system to handle a juvenile case appropriately, the legal consequences would have been minimal. Instead, they chose to protect their own interests at the cost of a little girl's life and the integrity of American justice. They turned a tragedy into a conspiracy. They turned an accident into a murder. They turned a moment of poor judgment by children into a decades-long cover-up that corrupted everyone it touched. The real crime in the JonBenét Ramsey case isn't what happened in that basement on Christmas night 1996. The real crime is what happened afterward, when powerful adults decided that preserving their own status was more important than justice for a murdered child. They got away with it because they understood something that most Americans refuse to believe, that in this country, wealth doesn't just buy comfort and opportunity. It buys different laws, different consequences, and different versions of the truth. The JonBenét Ramsey case is a masterclass in how the American justice system fails when confronted by people who have unlimited resources and unlimited willingness to use them. It shows us how crime scenes can be contaminated, witnesses can be silenced, evidence can be manipulated, prosecutors can be influenced, and public opinion can be shaped by people who understand that everything is for sale if you know the right price. But most importantly, It shows us that sometimes the cover-up doesn't just hide the crime, it becomes worse than the crime itself. Because what started as a tragic accident involving children became a systematic assault on truth, justice, and the very idea that all Americans are equal before the law. 28 years later, JonBenét Ramsey is still waiting for justice. Not because we don't know what happened to her, but because the people responsible for her death bought and paid for the right to never face consequences for their actions. Her case stands as a monument to American corruption, a reminder that in a country where money talks loudest, some voices are never heard. The beautiful 6-year-old girl who loved to perform, who dreamed of growing up to be a teacher, who trusted the adults in her life to protect her, deserved so much better than what she got. She deserved adults who would have put her safety above their own reputations. She deserved investigators who would have followed the evidence, wherever it led. She deserved prosecutors who would have been more afraid of failing her than of angering powerful people. She deserved a justice system that treated her death as seriously as it would have treated the death of any other child. Instead, she got a system that failed her at every level, that chose money over truth, influence over evidence, and silence over justice. And until we acknowledge how completely and systematically that system failed, until we understand exactly how money corrupted every aspect of her case, until we demand accountability from the people and institutions that chose to protect her killers instead of seeking justice for her death, JonBenét Ramsey will never rest in peace. Because justice delayed isn't just justice denied. Sometimes, justice delayed is justice that was never intended to exist in the first place. The truth about JonBenét Ramsey's death isn't a mystery anymore. It's a choice. A choice between accepting that some people are above the law or demanding that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of how much money they have or how much influence they can buy. The question isn't whether we'll ever know what happened to JonBenét Ramsey. The question is whether we'll ever care enough to do something about it. Thank you for following JonBenét's story to the end. If this case moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your final theory in the comments below. Because every voice that demands justice brings us one step closer to a world where money can't buy immunity from the consequences of taking an innocent life. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old when she died. She would be 34 now. She never got the chance to grow up, to fulfill her dreams, to live the life she deserved. The least we can do is make sure her death wasn't meaningless. The least we can do is demand that her case teaches us how to build a justice system that protects children instead of the people who harm them. The least we can do is remember her name and refuse to forget what happened when powerful people decided that their secrets were more important than her life.